Welcome to Caregiver Chats. Today, I'm talking about grief and the grieving process. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Hi, Dr. Lakelyn here. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an honor company. I'm so glad you're taking the time to listen. Be sure to subscribe to Caregiver Chats on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. I also love your questions. You can email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. That's homeinsteadinc.com. Loss is something we all experience in different ways, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a job, or independence. With loss comes grief, a complex and deeply personal journey that looks different for everyone. Grief isn't something we simply move past. It ebbs and flows, becoming lighter over time. Caregivers often face grief as they support loved ones in their final years, months, or days. For dementia caregivers, grief can be especially complex as they mourn someone who is still physically present. I'm looking forward to exploring this important topic with Dr. Eboni Green, a caregiving expert, author, and registered nurse with extensive hands-on experience. In addition to writing multiple books, speaking, and consulting, she is the founder of Caregiver Support Services and a professor at Walden University. Hi, Eboni. Thank you so much for joining me. It's exciting to have you here in person. We're both in Omaha based, so it's so fun to be here and talking with you about this really important topic.
Super exciting, Lakelyn. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, well, the pleasure is truly mine. And you wrote a book on the topic of grief. It's called Reflections from the Soul. I thought it'd be great to start out our conversation by telling us, why did you write this book? What was the inspiration?
So I will say that my inspiration is twofold.
Okay.
First, my grandmother. She's a very spiritual person and religious. And I lost her in my early 20s. And so a lot of the things I have in the book were helpful for me as I was grieving her loss. The second thing that's a little unique that brought me to writing Reflections is the opportunity that I had to train caregivers in person here in Omaha. And one of the final days of the actual didactic or course part of the training, we spent that day on grief. And I was astounded at how many people had not had an opportunity to express their grief and in a safe space. And so a lot of the other components are from those very rich conversations with folks who were training to be frontline caregivers.
Wow. Yeah, I think grief, for some reason in our society, death, dying, grieving, it's not something that we are always comfortable talking about. So it's hard for, I think, some people to express their grief, or they might not know, okay, what's normal grieving versus abnormal grieving? What does grief look like? But I think what is so interesting about grief is that it really is complex and it looks so different for everyone. So can you just share a little bit more about that and tell us, why does grief have to be so complex, or why as we as a society make it complex?
Well, I think what you mentioned is key. That often what's happening with individuals is that they don't have that safe space to talk about their feelings. I always think about, as caregivers, the time that you would get if you lost a loved one. That's pretty brief. It's usually bereavement is a short few days. You may be, or if you're at a progressive company, it may be a little bit longer than that, but then you're back to your regular activities. And so I think it's complex because we don't necessarily carve out environments where folks can express how they're feeling. And it's not really normalized, although we know it's something that everyone will face in their life.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you bring up such a good point. If you only have a week for bereavement, we might be feeling like, okay, I have to grieve that 1 week and then I have to just move on. And it's really not that simple. And I've heard so many talk about how grief comes and goes, and sometimes it will hit you out of nowhere or at a time when you least expect it. And so I think it really is too bad that we as a culture don't provide more time and space for grieving. I remember in my graduate studies, I took a course on death, dying, and grieving. It was one of my favorite courses. And we talked about grief and death and mourning throughout different cultures. And, like the Jewish faith, they sit Shiva for a certain number of days and really, I think, lean into that grieving process. And other cultures have their own traditions. And so I think, especially in our Western society, we're very independence focused. We have those values of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and moving forward. And I just wonder, is that kind of contributing to this mindset of, okay, I just need to grieve and move on, which it's not that simple.
It really isn't. And I think that you're right with regard to thinking about traditions and thinking about the brevity that we have in Western culture to move along. And so what I find is that, like many of the folks who were in the grief conversations that I had, it's just sitting there, like right before, under the surface. And as soon as we would start talking, you would have individuals who were just overcome with emotion. And that was really a profound experience and taught me so much about how much we push those feelings aside. And then what happens is individuals experience more complicated grief responses as a result.
Wow. I think that of grief just kind of being under the surface, I think for so many that's true. And I think it's important to realize, I know in your book you talk about the various dimensions of grief, the personal, spiritual, and familial. And so it's really more than just that surface level grief. There's different elements to it. So would you mind expanding on some of those elements?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I did also in my graduate work was my degree is in healthcare and healthcare administration, but I had the opportunity to take a counseling class that was really primarily filled with folks who were getting PhDs in psychology, but it was on grief. And I felt like I really wanted to have a solid foundation and understanding before diving into writing a book. So it was a big span of, I'll say a large span of time before I actually started writing between taking the course. But I was having those conversations with caregivers in between. And one of the things that I found interesting in the death and dying courses and coursework is that we really do revere Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the work that she has done. But I also had an opportunity to really understand in a more full, I'll say, and gain a more full appreciation of her work through that course, because the majority of her research was actually on patients who had received a terminal diagnosis, and her students were doing interviews with those folks. I mean, thousands of folks who were receiving a terminal diagnosis. And I found that later what we started to do is we didn't really have anything in that space. And as practitioners, we applied different theories to different populations. And so for a time, we really spent a lot of time with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief and applying that to the living. And I would start to see in about 2015 or 16, when I was reading, that we're noticing that those stages don't necessarily equate or easily translate to the living, because you don't necessarily you don't necessarily reach a point of acceptance, in my opinion, because you can still have moments of sadness.
Yeah.
So I really like to talk about feelings, emotions that individuals experience, and that you can relate to those emotions like sadness, crying. You can have points when you get a little bit further into your grieving process where you really have happy memories. And so something pops in your mind and you're really laughing and happy, but you still miss that person. So I think and the reason I bring up Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is because I think that places a lot of pressure on us, that we would go through these stages in about a year, and then we're going to be better. I lost my dad in 2021, and I am just being able to see like a reminder picture from Facebook or social media or what have you pop up, and not send me into a deep, feeling of grief. So I think that learning about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and identifying that we're going to have feelings that we feel as we're grieving, and that there's no time frame on that.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry for the loss of your father, and thank you for sharing your personal experience. And I think I'm sure those that are listening can probably identify with that. It does take a while to move through the elements of grief. And Dr. Kubler-Ross, I studied in grad school too, and I'm trying to remember all 5 of her stages of grief. So is it? I know one is denial, one is acceptance,
anger. I think depression. And
we might be
missing one.
We're missing the 5th. We'll have to look that up and put it in the show notes. But I think that you're right. I think that does put pressure on people. They feel like, okay, I should be moving on to this next phase. And some people have followed up her research and said, people don't always follow it in the same order. They might go back and forth. But I love that you attach the feelings and the emotions to it, because those are things that I think are very common. And so there is that kind of misconception that we have to move through these stages and it's going to take 1 year.
Right.
And I heard someone say once that grief never goes away. It just gets lighter over time. And I thought, wow, that's a really good way to describe it. And I think that gives people the space to continue their grief, or to realize, okay, what I'm feeling is normal. It's been more than a year and I'm still feeling these things. Nothing is wrong with you. You're grieving in the way that you're grieving. It's a very personal experience.
Absolutely. I think that there are times, however, when it's a good idea to reach out for help.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And what that looks like is, if you are not able to function, if you are, super angry, you're super depressed. So when folks have more of a complicated grief response, those are times where it's good to reach out for help. And I will be very transparent that with my father's passing, he was my person. So I have followed my own advice and have worked with a therapist and to address those feelings and how I could continue to honor our relationship, how I can still have a connection with him even though he's not here, and how I could reinvest my energy into meaningful experiences with my family and to create memories in that way. And that has taken a while. It has taken real work. And I won't say that it's been easy. And I will also say that if I had probably if I had tried to write reflections after losing my father, I would not have had the strength to do it. So I'm glad it was already written.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing how you worked through those complicated emotions. And I think you're absolutely right. If you are identifying in yourself, I might need more support. Certainly reaching out for counseling, therapy can be so helpful in processing and moving forward in grief. And I think, since this is a podcast for family caregivers, caregiving, there's a lot of emotions that go along with that role, even when the person is still living.
Yeah.
Especially for a dementia family caregiver or somebody living with cognitive impairment, they're watching their loved one change, maybe in their personality, or they're watching them decline. And they're kind of mourning that person, even though they're still physically present, which I think can be really hard. And there's a term for that, ambiguous loss, when we talk about kind of the research of caregiving, that term ambiguous loss. And I've heard caregivers say, wow, there's a term for that. It's good to know, again, I'm not alone in that feeling of mourning my loved one, even though they're still here. So do you have anything in your book about that, or have you come across that in your work with caregivers?
Yes, I absolutely have. And our family experienced, and I will say the caregivers in our family, with my grandmother, Gran, who's my paternal grandmother, and she had Alzheimer's. And so there were those of us that she would still be able to identify. And, even as she was pretty far along in the process, in her disease progression. But you have those feelings where, of course, you're very sad when you see someone you love who is in a different state, physical appearance, memory or cognitive loss. And I think we should also think about not only the family members that are experiencing both the grief that you and I are talking about and ambiguous grief, but also the professional caregivers who are either working in as a home care aide or non-medical aide, or who are in positions like you and I, because you develop those relationships with the folks that you are caring for, and you may be continuing to see them progress in their illness. And that's not always easy for folks who are family members and for folks who are also caring for someone in a professional capacity.
Gosh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we talk a lot about how our care professionals become like a member of the family, an extension of the family, because you're right, they do develop that relationship. And no matter the care setting, it's common for those relationships to form. And so you're right to watch a patient or client that you care for decline, and then losing them. That can also be hard, and it's important to honor those emotions and feelings, because that is also grief.
Right.
Just because you're not blood related to somebody doesn't mean that you can't grieve them and go through these same feelings of grief. So,
and you probably will. And I also think about things that happen simultaneously for our frontline caregivers. For example, if you lose a client, okay, now you're also going to have probably a new client, but you're no longer going to be going to that home. So your schedule or your assignments are going to change. You may not have a new assignment immediately. I also think about things like the relationships that folks develop with the family.
Yeah.
So that may or may not continue. So to me, there are a lot of things that folks who are in the frontline work experience simultaneously with the grief that can feel like things are being taken away, and they may not even be thinking in that manner that that's what's happening, but that's what's happening, and they're grieving that too.
That's a really great point. And you're right, it might not be a person that you're grieving. It might be a change in your schedule or routine. Or I even think about also kind of when we talk about all the different stakeholders, the care recipient, the individual that's aging or going through a diagnosis and treatment, they're probably also experiencing some of this grief too. Maybe they're grieving their loss of independence or grieving that terminal diagnosis. Or so I think grief, it is complex, and we have to think about it from all the stakeholders' perspectives and really honor their feelings and emotions wherever they're at. And so I'm glad that you brought that up as another kind of just facet to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you think that there's anything else that is unique to grief for caregivers that we haven't already covered that's important for this conversation?
I think that we don't necessarily, there are couple of exciting things or things that I think are really good conversation starters and thought provoking. And one of them is thinking about complicated spiritual grief. So in Reflections, I talk about Bobby Kennedy and his brother, our former president, and how our former president actually had, I think it was like celiacs or something like that, but he was very, very sick. And he, there was a story I read, and it said that his friends would joke that if a mosquito bit him, they worried for the mosquito because because he was very sick. So he was basically very much Robert Kennedy was very much a caregiver of his brother, and him even being around him or having positions that were close to him were so that they could, take care of him and make sure that his physical was taken care of. And so when JFK passed away, this was really hard on his brother. And he went into a spiritual crisis. And he would drink the same drink, wear his brother's certain clothing. He would smoke his cigars in order to still feel really close. But he also went through a very questioning phase because he had such strong faith. And how could this tragedy befall him and his family? And so I think sometimes folks don't have permission to think about their spiritual grief and how that may complicate the process of grieving. And those are opportunities to reach out. Another quick anecdote is you think about Mary Todd Lincoln. And of course, we're talking about the Civil War and all the folks that passed away there. But she also lost 2 sons in quick succession and the president. And so she had more of a post-traumatic stress response to grief. And so I think that there are more complicated aspects of grief. And then there's what you and I are talking about, where you are grieving, but it's not necessarily completely upending your life. And to know that if you do have a traumatic experience, that is okay. And it is okay for you to reach out for help. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to ask questions. And if you're going through a normal grieving process and you are triggered, that's okay too.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those stories. I think sometimes those stories can really help us relate to certain situations. And you're right, no matter how grief enters your life, it's okay. It's okay to feel those feelings and to process, whether it's traumatic or quote unquote normal, I guess, if you will, or more common. I know in your book you have offer up some kind of practical strategies, and I always love to provide our listeners with some kind of strategies or tips. So as somebody is moving through the grief process or the grieving process, maybe they're in the thick of it, what kinds of advice or tips would you suggest to them as they work through their grief?
So I think, first of all, we want to give ourselves permission to feel all the feels and to know that that's normal. We also want to give ourselves an opportunity to honor the person that we've lost. And so sometimes what I will see, and I have even experienced this myself, is that you'll have folks who are withdrawing from family activities because being around family reminds you of the people that are no longer with you. And so to do that in reverse, to not separate yourself from everyone and everything, and to actually be intentional about your interactions with individuals. And what I mean by that is to plan things where you're going to not be on your phone, you're not going to, be doing other things, and we're going to focus here on making some good memories. And so I would say being intentional about activities and getting together. On a personal note, I find journaling can be very helpful. If you're a person who is a worrier, and so maybe you're not sleeping at night, make a nice worry box. And
I like that.
I love crafts. So, you could get a shoebox or something of that nature and dress it up all nice. And then when you have a worry, you're laying down, you're trying to go to sleep, and you can't because you're thinking about something, write it down, put it in the worry box, and then do that for a period of 30 days or so. And then open up that box and see what are the either themes that you're seeing or what are things that you were worrying about that resolved themselves, so that you can start to identify ways to get back to that ability to sleep at night and not ruminate all night and worry and think about things that may or may not be that important. The other thing I would say is anything self-care. So anything that you can do that is really taking good care of yourself, that you feel rejuvenates you, to make sure that you have those things. Maybe it's something that's reoccurring, like a massage, or you're working out at a gym, or getting out to meet new people in that way. So I think there are, the other thing I wanted to mention is that you talked about sitting Shiva. And one of the things that families can do is do like the empty chair, where you could get, again, sticky notes or what have you, and get together and write down things that you all remember about your loved one. And then everybody pull their things off the chair and share that, because that's another way of honoring family. Finally, we've lost some significant folks in our life, my husband and I. And one of the things that I have found very rewarding from a spiritual level is I have a pond in my yard. And I have gone, and this summer, it's got little fishies and everything in it. And of course, not right now because it's freezing here.
Yes, dead of winter.
But I have stones that have our loved ones' names on them in the yard. So you can be looking out the window and you can still see the family members that that we've lost in love. And that was really like a really spontaneous thing to think of. And then we actually had time together, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, we all got together and had a dinner, and then we went out and placed those stones out there. And so just being really intentional about how you remember your loved one. And that's given me some really great peace.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those very practical ways that people can work through their grief, or that you've worked through some of yours. And I love that thought of intentionality. I think sometimes, when you are at a family gathering and someone brings up a story, there might be like this weird tension in the air. Oh gosh, are we allowed to talk about this person? Or are we not? Is it going to make so-and-so upset? So, being intentional and maybe setting the expectation up front, like at this family dinner, we are going to share stories and reminisce and look through photos. That can really just open it up for everyone to be intentional about honoring that individual and letting their legacy continue.
I think that's so important. I will say that we really have to, put our mask on first, get our take care of ourselves first. And then it's easier, in my opinion, to have the ability to be intentional if you're already dealing with loss in a healthy way.
That's true.
And now you can open it up for the rest of the family. Our son, when we lost my husband's mom, our son said to me through tears, he said, I don't know how you and Dad are doing all of the things that you're doing and holding up. This is really hard. I said to him, we're going through the same things that you're going through. He doesn't live at home anymore, so you just don't necessarily see what we're going through. So I think too, not hiding what we're experiencing from family and our children, spouses, gives them permission to be in touch with their feelings.
I think that's such a great point. And it is, usually a family that is grieving together, multiple people. And so to be open and to share how it's impacting you might give others kind of the quote unquote permission they need to continue their grief journey too.
Yeah.
What a really important example. And for those that are, wanting to kind of take those steps forward, I again, back to that death, dying, and grieving class,
Yes.
There was a panel of people who are going through the various stages of grief. And one of them said, you never get over grief, but you can move forward. And I thought, wow, that's a really powerful statement. Again, grief will kind of ebb and flow, come and go. As you mentioned earlier, you might be kind of struck by a moment where grief overcomes you and you weren't expecting it. But for most people, there is a way to move forward. It doesn't mean you're forgetting the person that you're grieving, but you're finding kind of your new normal. So any thoughts for those that are maybe kind of in that stage of the grieving process?
Well, I really do think that, again, safe space is important. I think that when you are going through your ebb and flow of feelings, to know that it's okay. I'll mention that when my father passed away, it was right before Thanksgiving. And so I cooked for Thanksgiving, but I wasn't happy. I was overcome with emotions while I was cooking, because that's really a great time to be thinking, because you're cooking and thinking and thinking and cooking. And so I had to take a year off from doing the primary cooking, because his passing date is close to the holidays, and that was really hard for the children to process. And knowing that I was very sad and overcome with grief, and and that it was going to be difficult for me to do some of the normal things was hard for them to process. And my daughter even said, when Dad lost his mom, he grieved, but it didn't change him. But when you lost Grandpa, you've changed. And I thought, well, how have I changed? And part of that is, again, really processing for myself and having to have time where the answer was going to be no, or I can't do that at this time, was really difficult for me. You mentioned about the quote that you were talking about. There's another one that I really love, and it says that some places, when you lose someone, you will may feel broken. It's like a broken leg that now starts to heal over. But you will, at some point, be ready to dance again. And you will dance beautifully with a limp. And I thought, that's basically where that really speaks to me, because you may have different times where you're feeling really grievous, and then over time it does seem to, if you're coping, if you're taking the time to address your feelings and feeling all the feels and knowing that that's okay, that you will have an opportunity again to dance beautifully with a limp.
Wow, I love that analogy. I'm so glad that you shared that. And I think that hopefully this conversation will be helpful to others who are going through this and feeling all those feels that we've been talking about. And I'm just so grateful, Eboni, that you've joined me today and been sharing with us your experience, both personally and then professionally, in the work you've done. And I would love for you in our last few moments together to share more about how people can get a copy of your book, Reflections from the Soul, and how they can follow your work and connect with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about grief. I think it is one of those things that gets pushed aside because it's a hard conversation.
It is,
and
yeah.
I think we've had it, we've discussed with ease, but it's not easy for
Right.
folks who are maybe not as intentional about learning about grief. The book Reflections from the Soul, and I have a copy here for you.
Thank you very
signed
much.
copy, is available on our Caregiver Support Services website. And that's just Caregiver Support Services, singular.com. And our books are right there on our book page. And I really do think that there are some things that are really important with addressing your grief. And I did try to cover those points in the book. It's separated into three spots, or three main areas, really looking overall at the things you may feel with regard to grief, an opportunity to then reflect, take action, and open yourself to being inspired. And so there are journaling activities throughout the book in the second part. And then the third part, families. There's a quote in there that says, folks sometimes can't help it. We're just family, and that's just what it is. And so the way another family member processes grief can also impact how you process grief. So I thought that was important to include there too.
Absolutely. Well, I have peeked at your book just a little bit, but excited to dive in. Thank you for this copy, and thank you for sharing more about the book and your website. And we'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes so people can stay connected and follow your work. And again, Eboni, thank you so much for joining me and for sharing today. I think you're right. Grief isn't talked about enough. And so we'll have to, continue this conversation on the Caregiver Chats podcast so people can continue to learn more about grief and processing. And I think it's also important, again, to reiterate that if you feel like you need support, it's okay to reach out and ask for support.
Please do.
Yes,
please
absolutely.
do. It will improve your life. And I also will say, if you run into a therapist that you don't necessarily connect with, don't stop there.
Yes.
Find somebody who, if you're having complicated grief is what I'm meaning, and find somebody who really you can connect with and be honest and feel your feels with that person. That's so important. That's so important.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you said that, because sometimes people feel like, oh, I've gone to one therapist, I need to stick with them. You can change it up if it's not working for you, but stick with it. As you mentioned, it can be so beneficial. So thank you again, Eboni. I can't wait to dive into your book and continue to learn about grief.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Eboni Green for joining me in this important conversation on grief. Grief is a personal journey, but you don't have to navigate it alone. Support, understanding, and healing are possible. Remember to give yourself grace and seek support when you need it. If you have additional thoughts or stories to share on this topic, I invite you to email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. That's caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. I also invite you to follow us on Facebook at Home Instead Inc. for previews of upcoming episodes, caregiving tips, and more. You can find all of the links in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please remember to take good care of yourself while you care for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, please visit homeinstead.com to learn more.